Hello and welcome to my video all about how to sew your own phone holder. This project came about after trying to watch videos on my phone whilst propping it up on a pillow, only to have the phone keep falling over. So this was my solution. It's a triangular stand that holds the phone at an angle without you having to prop it up on something unreliable. In order to make this phone holder, you're going to need a phone to prop up. Mine is an iPhone 7, but you can make this stand for any phone and any model just by changing the dimensions. Some fabric. The main piece of fabric you need should be fairly sturdy and woven. Denim and canvas work well. A small piece of stretchy knit fabric. This fabric is for stretching over the ends of the phone to hold it in place. I used a grey knit jersey. A scrap of another lightweight or medium weight woven fabric. I just used a small piece of calico. Some elastic. I used 8mm elastic. Some stuffing. I used polyester stuffing. Some plastic pellets or beanbag beans or rice or something similar for adding some weight to the back of the holder. A sewing machine and matching thread, although it is possible to hand sew it if you don't have a machine. You'll also need a hand sewing needle, some scissors, a ruler, some sewing pins, a protractor, some paper, a disappearing or magic fabric pen, an iron and ironing board, and scraps of cardboard. A couple of optional extras include a funnel and a rotary cutter and cutting mat. Okay, so the first thing you need to do is work out your measurements. Obviously, if you have an iPhone 7, you can just use the same dimensions as me, but otherwise you'll have to do a bit of planning. You'll need to work out how big the three sides of the holder are, how big the two triangular end pieces are, and how big the stretchy bands that will hold the phone in place need to be. First, measure your phone. I drew around my phone and measured the length and width from there. You'll also need the thickness or depth of the phone and the width of the end strips. The end strips being either end of the phone where there isn't an image displayed. If you don't have these end strips, you will need to imagine that you do, and that they are at least 50mm. Otherwise, there won't be enough area of fabric to hold your phone at each end. Then you'll need to decide on the angle that you want your phone to be held at. If you want it held straight up, then you would need to choose 90 degrees. I wanted a little bit of a tilt, so I chose 75 degrees. Note that you can print a protractor off the internet if you don't own one. Now you can work out the size of the side that the phone is going to be held against. This side needs to be the size of the phone plus 2 times the seam allowance. I used a seam allowance of 10mm, but obviously you can use whatever seam allowance you want. In my case, this side of the holder needs to be 160mm by 88mm. As a result, you now know the length of all the sides of the holder, because they're all the same. In my case, they are all 160mm long. Then you need to draw out the triangular end piece to scale. So draw a horizontal line on a piece of paper, then draw a line sloping up from this line that's at the angle that you've previously chosen. So in my case, I drew a line at 75 degrees. Previously, we've just worked out the size of the side of the holder where the phone is going to be held. The width of that side is going to be the length of this line. So in my case, that's going to be 88mm. Next, decide how wide you want the base of the holder to be. This should be at least as wide as the side where the phone will be held. So I chose 90mm for the width of the base. Bear in mind that the longer this measurement, the more stable your phone holder will be. Mark this distance from where your horizontal line meets your angled line. Then join this mark to the end of the angled line to create a triangle. The length of the line you just drew is the width of the back piece of the holder, and in my case this was 108mm. The triangle shape you now have is the exact size of the triangular end pieces, so you can use it as a template. So at this point, you now know the sizes of all the side pieces and of the triangular ends. So now we just need the measurements for the stretchy bands that go over the phone ends. The length of these bands needs to be the width of the phone side, which in my case is 88mm. The width of these bands needs to be 2 times the width of the end strips on the phone, plus 2 times the seam allowance, which in my case is 2 times 15mm, plus 2 times 10mm, which is 50mm. The next step is to cut out the paper templates. I recommend making a template for each of the side pieces, plus 1 template for the triangular end pieces, and 1 template for the stretchy bands. Make sure you label the templates as you make them. If you have an iPhone 7 like me, then the templates for the side pieces will measure as follows. The phone side will be 160 by 88mm, the back piece will be 160 by 108mm, and the base piece will be 160 by 90mm. The triangular end pieces will have sides of 88mm, 108mm, and 90mm. And finally, the stretchy bands will each measure 88mm by 50mm. Mark one side of the triangle template with the letter A, and write which edges match up with which side, whether that's the phone, the back, or the base side. Then do the same on the back of this template, but with the letter B written on instead. This is because we'll need 2 of these shapes, but they need to be mirror images of each other. If you want to check that the templates go together okay, then arrange them like this, and you'll see that the sides and the edges match up. Then draw around each of the 3 side templates using a fabric pen onto your main fabric. Then draw around the triangle template, flip it over, and then draw around it again. Then draw around the stretchy band template onto your stretchy knit fabric, and do this twice. Then you just need to cut these pieces out, either using scissors or a rotary cutter and a cutting mat. The next step is to add the stretchy bands. So you first need to cut out 2 pieces of elastic. These need to be 2 centimeters shorter than the length of the knit fabric pieces. In my case, they were 68mm long. Place each of these pieces of elastic lengthwise on each of the knit fabric pieces. You're now going to put these at each end of the phone side piece that you cut out of the main fabric. This main fabric piece should be right side up, and the knit fabric pieces should be wrong side up. Fold each piece of knit fabric lengthwise over the elastic, making sure that the raw edges of this fabric are pointing towards the shorter ends of the main fabric. Line up these raw edges and move the pieces of elastic so that they're right up against the fold. Make sure that one end of each of the elastic pieces is lined up with the same side of the main fabric. It doesn't matter which side you choose, so the elastic pieces could line up with the right side or the left side of the main fabric. Then pin these in place and sew down the side of the main fabric where the ends of the elastic lie. This is to attach the stretchy bands and the elastic pieces to one side of the main fabric. Use a straight stitch when you do this. Backstitch at the beginning and the end, and backstitch over the elastic to reinforce the stitching at these points. Make sure to use a seam allowance that's less than what you've chosen for the rest of the project. In my case, I sewed 5mm from the edge, as my chosen seam allowance is 10mm. You then need to do the same thing on the other side of the main fabric. This can be a bit fiddly because the elastic needs to be stretched to the other side of the main fabric, while still being contained in the knit fabric pieces. So to start with, you need to make sure that the knit fabric edges all still line up with each other and with the main fabric underneath. Then pin the elastic and the knit fabric bands in place and sew along this side. Again, use a seam allowance that's less than what you've chosen for the rest of the project. Don't worry that the main fabric curls up a bit, it's supposed to. Remember to backstitch over the elastic again to reinforce those areas. You should now have a line of stitching down each long side of the main fabric. The next step is where we attach the triangles. So mark each triangle, A or B, and write which edge connects to which side piece so that you don't get mixed up. You're going to add these triangles to the phone side of the holder first, which is the side we've just added the stretchy bands to. So pin the phone edge of each triangle to each end of this piece of fabric. Make sure that the edges line up and the fabrics are right sides together. Also make sure that you pin with the stretchy bands pulled flat inside the fabric sandwich. Sew along these edges using your chosen seam allowance for the project, which in my case is 10mm. This stitching should go through 4 layers of fabric. And now we need to add the remaining side pieces, so that's the back and the base. You need to sew these onto the long edges of the phone side. So start by pinning the base along one edge, right sides together. Then sew along this edge using your chosen seam allowance. Please note that you should start and stop sewing the line a seam allowance distance from the ends of the fabric. Also remember to backstitch at the beginning and the end as usual. At this point, you should check that your phone fits securely in the stretchy bands. If it doesn't, then now is the time to make alterations. Then you need to do the same thing to attach the back piece to the other long edge. For the next step, we need to complete the triangular shape by joining the back and the base together. So pin these two sides together and sew along the seam. Again, use your chosen seam allowance and start and finish the sewing line a seam allowance distance from the ends. Then pin one of the triangles onto the side pieces to close one end of the phone holder. Sew along these two edges using your chosen seam allowance. This will complete one end of the phone holder. Right, so the next step is just to fill the phone holder. You could just fill it with rice or beanbag beans or plastic pellets, but that would make it quite heavy, and some of those materials are quite expensive. So what I'm going to do is add a weighted section inside, but the rest is just going to be polyester stuffing. The reason we need to add a bit of weight to this phone holder is to counterbalance the weight of your phone. This weighted section needs to be attached to the opposite side to where the phone will be. So take your base paper template and cut out a piece of woven scrap fabric that's approximately the same size but a little bit shorter. I made my piece about 20mm shorter. Fold it in half and pin the edges. Sew along the long edge and one of the short edges. Pour some kind of weight into this fabric pouch until it's mostly full but still has some space at the top. If you own a funnel, then that will come in handy during this step. I personally use some plastic pellets that are designed to fill toys. The pouch needs to have some empty space inside because in a later step this pouch will need to fold up. Then pin the open end and sew this shut. Make sure you don't sew over any of the pellets. Next, you need to pin and sew this pouch to the seam opposite to where the phone will be, so that it lies against the base. I would say that this is the minimum amount of weight that you need for your phone holder, and if you decide you want to add more weight to balance your phone, you can add washers or rice or beanbag beans or other various items. You can also add a larger fabric pouch inside if you need to. You then need to turn the phone holder right sides out. To make the seams nice and crisp and neat, you can then iron them. Fill the phone holder with polyester stuffing, but make sure that you don't overstuff it because that will mean it won't be able to sit flat. Then cut out 2 pieces of cardboard, one a little smaller than the phone side and one a little smaller than the base. Push these into their corresponding places inside the phone holder in order to make the phone and base sides nice and flat. The next step is to use a hand sewing needle and matching thread to sew the remaining triangle onto the sides and finish the phone holder. It's best to pin the sides in place before you sew and make sure you fold the edges inside the phone holder as you join them. You don't want any raw edges on show. The invisible stitch is the best choice so that the stitches will be barely visible. I have a video on the invisible stitch if you need a reminder. And that's it, that's the phone holder completed. As you can see here, it holds the phone snugly and securely. And here are a few more photos of the result. I really hope you enjoyed this project and thank you very much for watching.